What if the single most consequential geopolitical rivalry of our era was not the result of ideology, not of religion, not of culture, but of calculated strategic decisions made in Washington decade after decade that Moscow watched, resented, and ultimately responded to with force? From the ashes of the Cold War, the United States inherited a world without a rival superpower. What it did with that moment, how it chose to treat Russia, what it promised and what it broke, who it listened to and who it ignored, shaped the arc of history from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the fires of Ukraine. This is the story of Washington's strategy toward Russia, the missed opportunities, the ideological blind spots, the triumphalism, the warnings that went unheeded, and the world that was built or perhaps destroyed as a result. The unipolar moment and the question of Russia, 1991 to 2000. When the Soviet flag descended over the Kremlin on December 25, 1991, and Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed, the United States found itself in a position unprecedented in modern history. For the first time since the rise of the European state system in the 17th century, a single nation possessed overwhelming dominance across every dimension of power: military, economic, technological, cultural, and institutional. Charles Krauthammer had coined the term the unipolar moment in 1990, imagining it as a fleeting opportunity. As the Soviet Empire dissolved without a single Western shot fired, many in Washington began to wonder if the moment might, in fact, be permanent. The critical question, and it was a question that consumed strategists, diplomats, academics, and policymakers through the entire decade of the 1990s, was what to do with Russia. The country that emerged from the Soviet collapse was vast, nuclear-armed, and historically proud, but also economically shattered, politically unstable, and desperate for Western engagement. The population of Russia had experienced a trauma so profound that it is difficult for outsiders to fully comprehend. In the span of a single year, their country, their ideology, their imperial identity, their sense of historical destiny, and their economic system had all simultaneously ceased to exist. The mortality rate rose sharply. Life expectancy fell. Suicide rates climbed. The Russian gross domestic product contracted by roughly 40% across the decade, a peacetime economic collapse without modern parallel. Into this vacuum stepped George H.W. Bush and, from January 1993, Bill Clinton. Their approach to Russia would diverge in some respects, but share a common underlying framework. Russia was not a threat. Russia was a partner in waiting. And the task of American strategy was to encourage Russia's democratic transition while managing the broader architecture of post-Cold War Europe. What this framework failed to adequately account for was how Russia itself experienced the transition, not as liberation, but as humiliation. The Bush administration's immediate concern in 1991 and 1992 was stability. Secretary of State James Baker worked closely with Gorbachev and then with Boris Yeltsin to ensure orderly nuclear succession, to prevent the fracturing of Soviet military command, and to manage the independence of the former Soviet republics with minimal violence. Baker famously traveled to the capitals of the new states, urging them to accept borders, reject ethnic nationalism, and embrace international norms. The administration's approach was notably cautious. Bush himself delivered a speech in Kiev in August 1991, before the coup attempt that would seal the Soviet Union's fate, actually urging Ukrainians not to pursue independence too hastily, a speech that earned him the mocking title of Chicken Kiev in the American press. The Clinton administration, beginning in 1993, pursued a more actively ideological approach. Clinton's foreign policy team, which included National Security Advisor Anthony Lake, Secretary of State Warren Christopher, and later Madeleine Albright, adopted a doctrine sometimes called democratic enlargement, the idea that the United States should actively expand the community of market democracies. This framework viewed Russia's internal political development and its external orientation as deeply connected problems. If Russia democratized successfully, it would become a natural partner of the West. If it failed to democratize, it would become an adversarial power again. The task was therefore to support Yeltsin's reforms while simultaneously managing Russia's role in the new European security order. The central institutional question of the decade was NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization had been created in 1949 specifically to deter Soviet power in Europe. With the Soviet Union gone, the alliance faced an existential question about its purpose and its future. Eastern European nations, particularly Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, were desperate to join. They had spent 40 years under Soviet domination and regarded NATO membership as the only credible guarantee that Russian power would never again reach their territory. Their urgency was understandable and, in historical context, entirely rational. But what had been promised to Russia? This question would become one of the most contested historical disputes of the post-Cold War era. During the negotiations over German reunification in 1990, American, British, French, and West German officials held a series of conversations with Soviet leaders about what would happen to NATO after reunification. James Baker, in a meeting with Gorbachev in February 1990, reportedly suggested that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward if the Soviets accepted German reunification within the alliance. Other Western officials made similar statements. Gorbachev and his foreign minister Eduard Shevardnadze later insisted that these statements constituted binding commitments. Western officials, particularly in the Clinton administration, insisted that no formal written agreement had been signed and that the assurances, to the extent they were given, applied only to the territory of East Germany, not to Eastern Europe more broadly. The historical record, substantially clarified by declassified documents from American, British, German, and Soviet archives, shows that the statements made were real, that multiple Western leaders made them, and that Soviet leaders interpreted them as commitments. The documents also show that the statements were not formalized into treaty language and that Western officials recognized this ambiguity at the time. Whether this constitutes a broken promise depends partly on legal interpretation and partly on a moral judgment about the weight of verbal assurances made in high-stakes diplomacy. What is not contested is that Russian leaders, first Gorbachev, then Yeltsin, then Putin, consistently cited these statements as evidence of Western bad faith. The Clinton administration's decision to proceed with NATO enlargement, formalized through the 1997 Madrid summit invitations to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic and their subsequent accession in 1999, was made over sustained Russian objection. Yeltsin made his opposition explicit and personal, warning Clinton in multiple conversations that NATO expansion would inflame Russian nationalism and undermine the reformers he was trying to support. The administration's response, as articulated by figures like Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot, was that Russia's security concerns could be addressed through a parallel institution, the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, which created a consultative council giving Russia a voice, but explicitly not a veto in alliance decisions. This satisfied neither Russian leaders nor, privately, some American strategists. George Kennan, the architect of Cold War containment strategy and perhaps the most respected living American strategic thinker at the time, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in February 1997 in which he called NATO expansion a tragic mistake. Kennan argued that the decision would inflame Russian nationalist and militarist tendencies, that was unnecessary given the absence of a genuine Russian threat, and that it would prove to be one of the most consequential errors in the history of American foreign policy. Kennan was 83 years old at the time. Almost no one in official Washington listened. The logic of alliance, solidarity, domestic political pressure from Polish-American and other Eastern European diaspora communities, and the institutional momentum of NATO itself all combined to make expansion feel not only desirable, but inevitable. Russia's experience of the 1990s under Yeltsin was not merely economic collapse and geopolitical humiliation. It was also the experience of watching the United States make decisions about European security that Russians regarded as directly affecting their vital interests, while treating Russian objections as irrelevant. The NATO air campaign against Yugoslavia in 1999, conducted without a UN Security Council resolution and therefore without Russian consent, produced a crisis of remarkable symbolic intensity. Russia's response. Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov was on an airplane to Washington when the bombing began and ordered the plane turned around mid-Atlantic, captured in a single image the depth of Russian resentment. By the end of the decade, even Boris Yeltsin, who had staked his political career on partnership with the West, was publicly complaining that Russia was not being treated as an equal. The Putin era begins. Strategic competition and selective cooperation, 2000 to 2008. Vladimir Putin did not arrive in the Kremlin as a fully formed adversary of the West. This is a point that many retrospective accounts obscure because it contradicts the narrative of inevitable conflict that has come to dominate contemporary discussions. The truth is more complicated and, in its way, more troubling. Putin arrived in power in 2000 as a pragmatist, a statist, and a nationalist who was also, initially at least, genuinely interested in some form of partnership with the United States. On his own terms, with Russian interests respected, and within a framework that recognized Russia as a great power rather than a supplicant. The failure to find a basis for such a partnership, and the reasons for that failure, constitute one of the central tragedies of the post-Cold War era. Putin had been nominated as prime minister by Yeltsin in August 1999 and had risen to national prominence through his conduct of the Second Chechen War, a brutal campaign to reassert Moscow's control over the rebellious Caucasian Republic that had effectively escaped Russian authority during the chaos of the 1990s. Russian apartment bombings in September 1999, which killed almost 300 people and which Putin attributed to Chechen separatists, though a minority of analysts have raised questions about the attribution, provided the political context for a military campaign that was far more decisive and far more brutal than the disastrous First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996. Putin's tough response played well, with a Russian public exhausted by the humiliations of the Yeltsin era and desperate for a sense of restored order and national dignity. When Putin was elected president in March 2000 with 53% of the vote, Western governments were cautious but not alarmed. His background in the KGB was noted but contextualized. Russia's intelligence services had been deeply involved in politics throughout the 1990s, and Yeltsin himself had relied on former Soviet security figures. What Western policymakers watched for was his approach to democratic institutions, to economic reform, and to relations with the West. In the early years, the signals were genuinely mixed. The September 11th, 2001 attacks created an unexpected opening. Putin was the first foreign leader to call President George W. Bush to offer condolences, and he moved quickly and substantively to support the American campaign in Afghanistan. Russia provided intelligence, allowed Central Asian states within its sphere of influence to host American military bases, facilitated arms transfers to the Northern Alliance, and offered to share counterterrorism information. Putin framed the collaboration in explicitly strategic terms. Russia had been fighting Islamist terrorism in Chechnya for years, he noted, and the United States had sometimes criticized Russian methods. Now Washington understood the threat Russia faced. For a brief period in late 2001 and early 2002, some serious strategists on both sides discussed the possibility of a genuine strategic partnership, even in some formulations, eventual Russian membership in NATO. Putin himself raised the possibility of NATO membership in interviews. Bush spoke warmly of Putin after their first meeting in Ljubljana in June 2001, famously saying he had looked into Putin's eyes and gotten a sense of his soul. The relationship appeared to have genuine potential, but structural factors worked against it. The Bush administration's decision to withdraw from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in December 2001 was a significant blow to Russian strategic interests and Russian pride. The ABM treaty was the foundational architecture of nuclear stability that had been negotiated at enormous effort during the Cold War, and Moscow regarded it as essential to the credibility of Russia's nuclear deterrent. The administration's argument that the treaty was a relic of Cold War thinking that prevented the United States from developing defenses against rogue state missiles struck Russian strategists as either naive or deliberately provocative. If American missile defenses could intercept the relatively small and primitive missile forces of Iran or North Korea, they could, with further development, also intercept a portion of Russia's retaliatory force, which was exactly the scenario that Russian military planners were required to plan for. The 2003 invasion of Iraq accelerated the deterioration. Putin opposed the invasion strongly, joining France and Germany in a public stance against military action, and the experience of watching the United States invade a sovereign country on the basis of intelligence assessments about weapons of mass destruction that proved to be wrong had profound effects on Russian strategic thinking. If Washington could do this, could simply override international law and the United Nations Security Council when it judged its interest to require it, then the entire framework of international norms that Russia had been urged to join and respect was revealed as selectively applicable. Rules, it appeared, were for countries that lacked the power to exempt themselves. The color revolutions of 2003 to 2005, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, were interpreted in Washington as spontaneous popular expressions of democratic aspiration, assisted by American and European civil society organizations promoting good governance, free elections, and the rule of law. The National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, the Open Society Foundations, and similar organizations have provided training, funding, and organizational support to civil society groups in these countries, a practice that American officials regarded as entirely legitimate democracy promotion. Putin and the Russian security establishment saw it very differently. From their perspective, the color revolutions were American-orchestrated regime change operations designed to install pro-Western governments in states that Moscow regarded as within its historical sphere of influence. The fact that genuinely popular grievances drove the revolutions, that Ukrainians and Georgians were expressing authentic frustrations with corrupt governance, was acknowledged, but in the Russian reading, did not eliminate the role of Western organizational and financial support. Putin began reorganizing Russian domestic politics to prevent similar scenarios from developing inside Russia itself, cracking down on foreign-funded civil society organizations and tightening control over media and political opposition. The 2004 expansion of NATO to include 7 new members, the 3 Baltic states plus Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, was a particularly sensitive moment. The inclusion of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania meant that NATO now bordered Russia directly for the first time. These 3 states had been part of the Soviet Union itself, not merely the Warsaw Pact, and their incorporation into the Western Alliance was a development that Russian military planners found genuinely alarming, regardless of whether that alarm was proportionate by Western assessments. By 2007, Putin's frustration had reached the point of public expression. At the Munich Security Conference in February of that year, he delivered a speech that became one of the most consequential addresses in post-Cold War diplomatic history. Speaking without the diplomatic hedging that had characterized earlier Russian complaints, Putin directly challenged the American-led unipolar world order. He criticized NATO expansion, the potential deployment of American missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, Western interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states, and the tendency of the United States to present its own foreign policy interests as universal values. The speech was widely reported in the West as aggressive and alarming. It was also, by almost any objective reading, an accurate description of Russian strategic grievances as they had accumulated over 16 years. The Bush administration's response was to proceed with the policies Putin had criticized. Plans for missile defense installations in Poland and the Czech Republic continued. The possibility of Ukrainian and Georgian NATO membership was placed on the agenda for the April 2008 Bucharest summit. When that summit arrived, France and Germany blocked immediate membership offers on the grounds that expanding NATO to include Ukraine and Georgia was unnecessarily provocative. Bush pushed for membership as a signal of Allied commitment. The compromise, a declaration that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO without specifying a timeline or pathway, managed to simultaneously antagonize Russia by holding out the prospect of membership, while also failing to provide the firm security guarantees that meaningful membership would have entailed. The Georgian War, Reset, and the Return of Confrontation, 2008 to 2014. In August 2008, for months after the Bucharest summit, Russian and Georgian forces fought a brief but decisive war over South Ossetia. The conflict lasted 5 days, ended with a French-brokered ceasefire, and left Russia in control of two separatist regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that it subsequently recognized as independent states. The war was the first military conflict between Russia and a post-Soviet state, and it sent shockwaves through the foreign policy establishments of Europe and North America. The reaction in Washington, however, was constrained by a simple reality. The United States had no treaty obligation to defend Georgia, and the incoming Obama administration, which had won the presidency in November 2008, was determined to chart a new course. The Reset policy, announced in 2009, was the Obama administration's attempt to restore a functional working relationship with Russia. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov physically handed each other a red button labeled Reset, or rather, labeled Перегрузка, which actually means overload in Russian, a translation error that was quickly noted and became briefly symbolic of the policy's eventual trajectory. The underlying idea was serious, even if the presentation was awkward. The Bush-era relationship had deteriorated to the point of near breakdown, and a deliberate effort to find areas of common interest and to rebuild functional communication was strategically necessary. The Reset produced genuine achievements. New START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty signed in April 2010, was a substantive nuclear arms control agreement that reduced deployed strategic warheads and delivery vehicles on both sides and, crucially, reinstated the inspection and verification regimes that had lapsed when START-I expired in December 2009. Russia's cooperation with sanctions against Iran over its nuclear program was diplomatically significant, as was Russian support for the Northern Distribution Network that provided a supply route for NATO forces in Afghanistan. At the United Nations Security Council, Russia abstained on or supported several resolutions that it might have blocked in the more confrontational atmosphere of the mid-2000s. But beneath the surface of functional cooperation, structural tensions remained unresolved. The Obama administration's decision to proceed with a modified version of Bush's missile defense plan, modified in location and technology, but still fundamentally opposed by Russia, confirmed Russian fears that missile defense was a permanent American strategic priority regardless of which party controlled the White House. The pivot to Asia, announced in 2011 and 2012, was understood in Moscow less as a response to China's rise than as a strategic reorientation that revealed Washington's view of Russia as a secondary concern, which, depending on one's perspective, was either reassuring or deeply insulting. The Arab Spring of 2011 and its consequences drove a further wedge. Russia had abstained on the UN Security Council resolution authorizing intervention in Libya, allowing the NATO air campaign that ultimately contributed to Muammar Gaddafi's overthrow. Putin, who was prime minister while Medvedev served as president during 2008 to 2012, publicly criticized Medvedev for the abstention, calling the Security Council resolution a defective document and comparing the intervention to a medieval crusade. When Gaddafi was killed by a mob in October 2011 and the video circulated internationally, Putin watched it and reportedly commented on the manner of Gaddafi's death in ways that suggested genuine concern about what it implied for the personal fate of leaders who cooperated with the West and then became inconvenient. The lesson Putin drew from Libya was explicit. Sovereign states that gave up their weapons of mass destruction and cooperated with Western demands were ultimately vulnerable to Western-supported regime change. The lesson would inform his thinking about Ukraine. The Syrian civil war beginning in 2011 created an immediate test case. The Obama administration called for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to step down, provided support to opposition groups, and periodically threatened military action. Russia provided Assad with diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, vetoing multiple resolutions, and eventually in 2015 intervened militarily. For Washington, Syria was a humanitarian catastrophe and a test of international norms about chemical weapons use. For Moscow, Syria was a sovereign state and a long-standing Russian partner being subjected to externally supported regime change of exactly the type Moscow had feared since the color revolutions. Putin's return to the presidency in 2012. He had swapped positions with Medvedev, an arrangement most Western governments regarded as a constitutional manipulation, was accompanied by a renewed crackdown on domestic opposition. Protests in Moscow following parliamentary elections that many observers regarded as fraudulent were met with arrests, new legislation restricting civil society organizations with foreign funding, and increasing pressure on independent media. The Obama administration and European governments criticized these developments. Putin responded by expelling USAID from Russia and characterizing American democracy promotion as interference in Russian internal affairs. Then came Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. The proximate cause of the crisis was President Viktor Yanukovych's decision in November 2013 to suspend negotiations for an association agreement with the European Union under pressure from Moscow, which offered Ukraine a substantial economic package to remain within Russia's economic orbit. Mass protests erupted in Kyiv, centered on Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, and persisted through the winter. In February 2014, after a period of escalating violence in which more than 100 protesters were killed by security forces, Yanukovych fled to Russia. A new interim government took power and immediately sought closer integration with Europe. Russian analysts and officials have consistently characterized these events as a Western-backed coup. American officials, including Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, were indeed engaged with Ukrainian opposition leaders during the protests. A phone call in which Nuland discussed which opposition figures should be in the new government was intercepted and released, causing considerable embarrassment. The European Union was offering Ukraine a trade agreement with significant implications for its relationship with Russia. Western governments were openly supportive of the protesters. Whether this constitutes regime change orchestration or support for democratic aspirations depends significantly on one's analytical framework, and the debate continues among historians. What is not contested is that Russia's response was rapid and decisive. Russian special forces, officially denied at the time but subsequently acknowledged by Putin, seized control of the Crimean Peninsula in late February and early March 2014. A referendum held under military occupation produced a result: 97% in favor of joining Russia. That was not internationally recognized, but which provided Moscow with a political justification for annexing Crimea on March 18, 2014, the first annexation of European territory since World War II. In the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, Russian-backed separatists, supported by Russian volunteers and eventually Russian regular military forces, seized territory and declared the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Washington's response was sanctions, substantial and significant, coordinated with European partners, and expanded over subsequent months, together with political isolation, military reassurance of NATO allies, and significant non-lethal assistance to Ukraine. The Obama administration, after considerable internal debate, declined to provide lethal military equipment to Ukraine, calculating that doing so would escalate the conflict without decisively changing its outcome and would sacrifice opportunities for diplomatic resolution. Critics, including many in the Ukrainian government, argued that this calculation was wrong and that deterring further Russian action required demonstrating that the military cost of aggression would be real. Escalation to full-scale war and the transformation of American strategy 2014 present. The 8 years between Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 were a period of slowly intensifying confrontation punctuated by sporadic diplomatic efforts that ultimately failed to address the fundamental incompatibility between Russian and Western strategic objectives. Washington's strategy during this period underwent a gradual but significant transformation, moving from an emphasis on managing the relationship with Russia toward an increasingly explicit acknowledgement that Russia under Putin represented not a difficult partner, but a genuinely adversarial power whose ambitions were structurally incompatible with the American-led international order. The Trump administration, despite its president's unusually positive personal orientation toward Putin and his public skepticism of NATO, paradoxically deepened several concrete American commitments to confronting Russian power. The administration approved the sale of Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, a step Obama had declined to take, increased American military presence in Eastern European NATO states, and maintained, and in some respects tightened the sanctions architecture imposed after 2014. Congressional pressure, reflected in legislation like the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act of 2017, made it politically difficult for the administration to follow its stated impulse toward rapprochement with Moscow. The tension between Trump's personal relationship with Putin, which generated enormous political controversy, and the 2-year investigation led by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, and the institutional policy of the American government toward Russia produced a peculiarly incoherent strategic posture that left both allies and adversaries uncertain about American intentions. The Biden administration arrived in January 2021 with the explicitly adversarial framing of the Russia relationship. Biden had called Putin a killer during the 2020 campaign, and while the administration initially pursued a summit meeting in Geneva in June 2021, which produced a joint statement on strategic stability, its overall posture was defined by the language of democratic versus autocratic competition. The administration's strategic competition framework identified Russia and China as the primary long-term challenges to American power and the American-led international order. Russia, in this framework, was a disruptive power, dangerous and capable of causing serious damage, but ultimately in structural decline, a power seeking to prevent the consolidation of a liberal international order rather than to establish an alternative one. The military buildup on Ukraine's borders that began in late 2021 and accelerated through early 2022 was closely monitored by American intelligence agencies, which made the unusual and deliberate decision to declassify and publicize much of what they observed. The Biden administration strategy was explicit. By revealing Russian plans before they were executed, it hoped to both deter the invasion and, if deterrence failed, to deny Russia the element of surprise and expose its intentions to the world. In December 2021 and January 2022, Russia presented formal proposals demanding legally binding guarantees that Ukraine would not join NATO and that NATO would withdraw its forces from Eastern European member states. The United States and NATO rejected the core demands, on the grounds that excluding Ukraine from possible NATO membership would violate the alliance's open-door principle and that withdrawing forces from Eastern Europe would undermine the security of existing NATO members, while offering dialogue on arms control and confidence-building measures. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine from multiple directions simultaneously, in what Putin initially described as a special military operation designed to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. The attack was the largest military operation in Europe since World War II, involving hundreds of thousands of troops and striking at Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, and multiple other cities. The expected rapid collapse of Ukrainian resistance did not occur. Ukrainian forces, trained and equipped with increasing seriousness over the previous 8 years, and fighting with the powerful advantage of defending their own soil, repelled the assault on Kyiv within weeks. Russian forces suffered catastrophic losses in men and equipment, and by early April 2022, Moscow had abandoned its northern offensive and reoriented toward the south and east. American strategy in the war's early phases was defined by several overlapping objectives and tensions. The administration provided Ukraine with increasingly significant military assistance, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, Javelin anti-tank missiles, and eventually much heavier systems, including M777 howitzers, HIMARS rocket systems, Patriot air defense batteries, and eventually M1 Abrams tanks, and, controversially, long-range ATACMS missiles. Each decision to provide a new category of weapon was preceded by months of internal debate, diplomatic consultations with allies, and public statements about the importance of not provoking escalation. Critics argued that this approach, providing enough assistance for Ukraine to survive but calibrated to avoid Russian escalation, prolonged the war without enabling Ukrainian victory. Supporters argued that the calibrated approach successfully prevented Russian escalation to nuclear or chemical weapons while sustaining Ukrainian resistance. The sanctions strategy imposed after February 2022 was the most comprehensive economic isolation ever imposed on a major economy. Russia was expelled from the SWIFT international banking system. The assets of the Russian central bank held in Western countries were frozen. Approximately $300 billion, and unprecedented export controls were applied to technology goods. The expectation in Washington and Brussels was that the Russian economy would collapse within months. The reality proved more complicated. Russia redirected its trade toward China, India, Turkey, and other states that declined to join the sanctions regime. And while the Russian economy was significantly damaged, it demonstrated greater resilience than Western analysts had predicted, partly because energy revenues remained substantial and partly because the Russian state's capacity for economic control in crisis conditions proved more effective than market economy analysts had anticipated. The war fundamentally reshaped NATO. Sweden and Finland, historically neutral states that had maintained independence from military alliances throughout the Cold War, applied for NATO membership in May 2022 and were admitted. Finland in April 2023, Sweden in March 2024, in what was perhaps the most consequential strategic consequence of the invasion. Rather than preventing NATO expansion, which Putin had cited as a core motivation for the war, the invasion produced the largest expansion of NATO since the Cold War. American military presence in Eastern Europe increased substantially. Defense spending across European NATO members rose significantly as governments that had long argued that security could be achieved through diplomacy confronted the reality of a land war on the European continent. Washington's strategy toward Russia had, by the mid-2020s, settled into a framework that differed fundamentally from any previous iteration. The management of the relationship, with its summits, its arms control negotiations, its cooperative frameworks for managing strategic competition, had given way to a posture of sustained containment and support for Ukraine's military resistance. The question that remained, the question that historians and strategists will debate for decades, is whether the decisions made across 30 years of post-Cold War policy had made this outcome more likely or less, whether alternative choices at critical junctures might have produced a different Russia and a different relationship, or whether the structural forces of great power competition made some version of this confrontation inevitable regardless of the specific decisions made by specific individuals at specific moments in history. The honest answer, as with most consequential historical questions, is that we do not know with certainty. What we can observe is the world that actually exists, a Russia that has chosen military aggression over diplomatic accommodation, a Ukraine that has chosen resistance over submission, a Europe that has chosen collective defense over appeasement, and an America whose strategy toward Russia has traveled the full arc from Cold War victory to partnership attempt to strategic competition to sustained confrontation. A journey whose destination, even now, remains undetermined.